And I do want to remind you, after you give that initial SD, no verbal communication should be used until after the chain is complete. So again, in chaining, after you give that initial SD, no verbal communication should be used until after the chain is complete. And of course, that is for backward and forward chaining. In total task analysis or total task chaining, that is a bit different. Okay, remember that because that's where we're reinforcing each step. But for forward and backward chaining, after you give that initial SD, no verbal communication should be used. Why is that? Well, because verbal cues or verbal prompts will encourage the student to depend on that instructor to know what the next step is. We don't want that to happen. Okay? We want the actual step, the completion of the step, to be the SD for the next step, not a verbal cue. Okay? So we want to make sure there's no verbal exchanges going on. The purpose of chaining is for the student to independently complete the task given one verbal instruction. Verbal praise stands out a lot more at the end. So once the whole task is done, then we can give some verbal praise, but only then, when the whole task is complete. So what reinforcer should we give? Reinforcers are provided according to how the program is written. Read that program carefully. Sometimes a specialist or analyst will put the specific reinforcer to use after the chain. Also, some chains have, like I was saying earlier, the built-in reinforcer, as the person gets to complete the activity independently and engage in whatever, if it is something like scooping ice cream or putting their shoes on. So again, it will depend. This is why it is important to read the written program procedure prior to implementing chaining, or any other program for that matter. As an RBT, you'll be trained to do this in the field as well. So, in forward and backward chaining, when do we reinforce? Once the entire task is completed. We don't reinforce between steps for forward and backward chaining. We only reinforce when the entire task is completed. As an RBT, you'll be working with individuals that have problematic behavior. To address these problematic behaviors, we have a written behavior reduction plan. A formal behavior plan is a document that outlines the procedures for reducing a problem behavior. This will be gone over with you by either the analyst or it will also be in the report. Be familiar with this document. So what is included in a written behavior reduction plan? There are 4 broad areas. The definition of the problem behavior. This is the behavior of interest. This will include baseline data for the frequency or duration or intensity, or all 3, as well as baseline conditions. It will also include antecedent conditions and consequence conditions. What are some of the current triggers, and what are some of the current consequences or reinforcement that the behavior has gotten that person. It will also have antecedents. Okay, what are some antecedent conditions that we can use to reduce the target behavior? Basically, it's how we can set up the environment to reduce the likelihood of the behavior. It will also have a section on replacement skills or behaviors. These are to be taught so the patient will allow them to access whatever the function of the behavior is. And the function of the behavior is what the person gets out of it. So the replacement skills or behavior section are what we're going to do instead of the problem behavior. This may involve teaching the person how to wait, or teaching the person to ask appropriately. Basically, it tells us what the person can do instead of the problem behavior to get what they want. And there should also be a time in there when to reinforce. Consequences, or reactive strategies. These are procedures that are to be followed when the behavior does occur. So again, what is included in a written behavior reduction plan are four main elements. The definition of the behavior of interest. This will include baseline data for frequency, duration, or intensity, or all three, as well as baseline antecedent conditions. So what are the current antecedent conditions that are fashioning the behavior, and what are the current consequences or reinforcement that is leading to the behavior. It will have an antecedent section. These are antecedent conditions that are designed to reduce the target behavior. It will have a replacement skills or behavior section. What this teaches what the person can do instead, and also when you should reinforce the behavior, when the good behavior, the appropriate behavior. And it will have a consequence or reactive strategy section. These are procedures that are to be followed when the behavior does occur. So here is an example definition that you may see in the behavior plan. Simon is a 5-year-old boy who throws marbles at the wall whenever his sister leaves the room. He engages in this behavior 3 to 4 times a day. When Simon throws a marble, his father typically says, "No, Simon," threatens to take away Simon's piggy bank, and returns Simon's sister to the room. So if you notice, there's a definition of what the behavior is, throws a marble, a frequency 3 to 4 times a day, what the current consequences are. His father says no, threatens to take away Simon's piggy bank, and returns Simon's sister to the room. Those are all current consequences. Current antecedents would be whenever his sister leaves the room. That is an example definition of a problem behavior. Current antecedent conditions. Current antecedent conditions in a written behavior reduction plan are what the antecedent conditions are that precede the behavior. Remember, antecedents occur before the behavior. So the antecedent conditions in the behavior plan are what were identified during the assessment to be the conditions that lead to the behavior or can trigger the behavior or make the behavior more likely. So here, Simon being told he cannot have something, Simon being told not yet, or Simon being told to transition from one task to another were all identified antecedent conditions that led to the target behavior of crying. Of course, these are important to know because as at RBT, you can manipulate antecedent conditions to make a behavior less likely. Current consequences. These are what were identified in the assessment or through ongoing ABC data to be the current consequences. What are the consequences that are maintaining the behavior? What does the person get out of it? The most common consequences. So here, the parent will comfort Simon, telling him it's okay. Simon will occasionally get the item he wants. Simon will be allowed to complete the activity. Those are all current consequences or consequences that are maintaining the behavior. So, in a different part of this training, you will go over functions of behavior. But let's do a little preview right now. So the parent will comfort Simon, telling him it's okay. This suggests an attention function, that Simon is getting attention for this behavior. Simon will occasionally get the item he wants. This suggests a tangible, or access to tangible function, that he is allowed to get something for engaging in the behavior. Simon will be allowed to complete the activity. This suggests perhaps access to tangibles, but also an avoidance or escape. An avoidance or escape from the demand of changing activities. Or escape avoidance of changing tasks. It is important to know the function of the behaviors because the next section is what we're going to do instead and to allow the person access in a more appropriate manner. Before we do that though, we have to look at what the hypothesized function of behavior is. So here, like I alluded to earlier, adult attention, comfort from the parent, access to tangibles, receiving the item, and escape or avoidance, avoiding having to transition when asked. The functional alternative responses. This is what we're going to have the person do instead. In most reports, or most goals, or most goal list, they're going to have goals that relate to these. So for example, let's go through these and we'll talk about what the goals might be in the goals list. So teach him to say okay. Hug first. We could teach him to do that. This would address the attention function. This would allow him to get adult attention in a much more appropriate way. Teach him to wait appropriately for the item, asking when can I have it. This addresses the tangible items when told not yet. Teach him to look for another item to play with. This also addresses the tangible items. And teach him to ask for more time to finish, or can I finish first. This addresses escape or avoidance. And we can do other skills like teaching him to wait. So, I said earlier about the goals list. In every report there will be a goals list. Goals sometimes will match up with these functional alternative responses. For example, a goal might read, we will have Simon ask for more time, at least 5 times daily, or something like that. But the point is here, in a behavior plan, know what the hypothesized functions are so that we can provide alternative responses. Because remember, it is much better to say, okay, hug first, to get adult attention than crying for 5-10 minutes. Antecedent changes. This section deals with what we can do as antecedent manipulations. We can provide transition warnings. Known trigger items can be put away. We can use a timer to count down for transition times, or use a timer to note when something is available. While we can also provide attention for when he is engaging in appropriate behavior throughout the day. We can use our first thing contingency, and we can also reinforce following instructions throughout the day. The point is, these are things that we can do before a behavior occurs to make the behavior less likely to occur. Again, the antecedent section, the antecedent changes, are what we can do to prevent the behavior from occurring in the first place. Of course, that won't work 100% of the time, but that's alright. We're trying to set up environments to make it less likely. As an RBT, part of your job during session is to do that. So maybe you know a certain item is a trigger. Put that away. Don't use it as reinforcement. Use those timers. Use the first in contingencies. And remember, first in contingency is this, like this. First we do this, and then you do this. You have to establish that. Consequence changes. This is what we can do if the behavior does occur. Remember, behavior probably will occur. So what are we going to do instead of what the current consequences are? So remember, if you go back and look at the current consequences, there's comfort from parent, sometimes he's allowed to finish the activity, etc., etc. So now the consequence changes are what we're going to do instead if the behavior does occur. We have to have that planned as well. We might use planned ignoring. This addresses the attention function. Okay. Do not make eye contact. Do not comfort him. Wait for him to stop crying to provide attention. And if he is engaged in the activity and won't transition, we'll have to prompt him out of the activity. We can't allow him to continue. Again, those are consequence changes. We make those. Those are what we can do when the behavior does occur.